All right, today we're going to deal with the aftermath of World War II and our transition into what's known as the Cold War. So, we talked previously about how the conferences that were being held during the war were mainly focused on the post war world. Well, of course, this had all not been totally finalized by the time the war ended. And so there's a series of other conferences that are happening sort of in the very late phases of the war that solidified some of these things that the earlier conferences were doing. Obviously, they bring as many of the victors here together as possible in these conferences, but again, they were dominated by the quote unquote big three, the leader of England, Winston Churchill, the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, and at least for this first conference, Franklin Roosevelt is still alive, so the leader of America, Franklin Roosevelt. We had talked previously. We had talked previously about some of the other conferences. Specifically, I don't think I mentioned the name, the Tehran Conference, where they established cooperation, and then at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, they decided on the whole United Nations thing, and we talked about the principles behind that. So, but Yalta was the sort of conference that really set the stage for the post-war world. And at Yalta, Roosevelt was intently aware of the fact that the vast majority of the war against Hitler had been fought by Stalin at this point. That Hitler had been able to steamroll basically every other country he'd gone up against, and the only place where he found any real resistance in Europe, besides, of course, England holding out, is his invasion of Russia. And so the Russians had taken massive hardships. We had, of course, given huge amounts of aid to Russia, and the Russians were aggressively pushing back the Germans at this point, and were mostly the defeat of the German armies at Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Moscow mostly paved the way for the defeat of Nazi Germany. And so we really did understand that the Russians were wholly, or at least mostly, responsible for the defeat of Germany at this point. And so at Yalta, it was a very congenial meeting. They agreed to divide up Germany once it was destroyed once they were finally defeated, into four occupation zones, one for each of the great powers. So you can see the Soviet occupation zone, the British occupation zone, the American occupation zone, and the French zone, and to divide up the city of Berlin also amongst those powers. So Germany doesn't get to be a country anymore. We they are on the losing side of two world wars, and at this point, we're just going to dismember you. The other piece that was decided at Yalta was that the country that liberated territory would be responsible to some extent for rebuilding it. And so a lot of Eastern Europe that was liberated by Stalin and the Soviets would be rebuilding, whereas the United States would be rebuilding Western Europe, the area that we sort of were more responsible for liberating. The Potsdam Conference happened after the war, and there's a number of important things you need to understand about Potsdam. One, the big three are going to look slightly different here. Well, at least two of them are going to look slightly different. Hopefully, you still recognize America's best friend, Joseph Stalin, over here. But FDR is now dead and has been replaced by Harry Truman. And while they were at the conference, Winston Churchill lost the election in England and is replaced here by Clement Attlee. So that's one difference. Obviously, the big three are relatively. Another difference is the United States has already dropped the atomic bomb. So, and of course, we are refusing to share atomic technology with anyone else. We're holding on to our atomic monopoly as long as possible. And so, the other, obviously, the big two view the United States with some level of suspicion at this point, because of course we've got this super weapon that we didn't tell anyone about, and no one else has it. So that's part of the issue. The other issue, though, and part of the other issue is the both of the other sides viewed Truman as somewhat of a political neophyte with no foreign policy experience, which, admittedly he was. But Stalin had also started acting somewhat suspiciously in Europe, especially in the European parts that he was rebuilding. The United States and Great Britain, tried to make sure that democracy was going to be the, the government of choice in the liberated territories. Sort of following on Wilson's 14 points, these liberated territories are going to become free and independent. But we'd already been started to become suspicious of the Russians, and Truman especially was much more aggressive towards communism and suspicious of Joseph Stalin than FDR was. And so what we start to see is a gulf growing between the United States and the Soviet Union, with the rhetoric becoming slightly harsher, the conditions becoming less sort of trusting, and you could start to see the post-war world emerging at Potsdam with a bipolar world with the Soviet Union on one side and the United States on the other. One thing that everyone did somewhat agree on is the creation of this new United Nations. This was the successor, of course, to the League of Nations, and you don't need to know the details about the United Nations. It's a global peacekeeping organization, where we try to talk out our differences rather than fighting, but there's limited enforcement power unless everyone agrees. There's all of these problems with the UN. It's divided into the General Assembly, where everyone is there, gets a voice, gets a vote, all this stuff, and the Security Council, which is much more exclusive. The Security Council is made up of 15 members, the five permanent members, which you can see up the top here, who have a absolute veto right, and then a rotating series of another 10 members that are elected to 2-year terms from different regions, all this fun stuff. So what's important to note is, of course, with these permanent members, the fact that the Soviet Union and the United States both have seats on the Security Council means that any sort of resolution that's too strongly worded against either one of those is going nowhere because it's going to get immediately vetoed. So there's that. That's going on. The other issue with the United Nations is China has a seat on the Security Council, but China is in the midst of a civil war at this point between the Kuomintang, the Communist Party, or the Chinese Nationalist Party, and of course the Chinese Communists led by Mao Zedong. And so you've got this civil war going in China with the Soviet Union well, not tacitly, obviously supporting the Chinese communists, and the United States and Great Britain still supporting the Chinese nationalists. And so this becomes a major sticking point, of course, when the civil war is won by the communists and the communists take over mainland China and create what is called the People's Republic of China, whereas the nationalists moved to the island of Formosa or Taiwan and continue to rule as the Republic of China, what they argue is the legitimate government of China in exile. And so, which of these two Chinas sits on the Security Council? Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the post war in Asia situation tomorrow. But we're going to push the Republic of China onto the Security Council, and the People's Republic of China is not going to be recognized by the United States for the first 20 years of its existence, which causes significant tensions between both the United States and the People's Republic of China, of course, but also with the Soviet Union. So all of those things complicate the fact that the United Nations is supposed to be this altruistic, peace-loving organization, and it's going to struggle to maintain global peace because of this. Europe is, of course, devastated by the war. Strategic bombing has destroyed most of the industrial facilities in Germany. Everyone else had lived under, with the exception of Great Britain, who was bombed by the Germans and the Luftwaffe, of course. Everyone else had lived under Nazi occupation, which was, of course, incredibly unpleasant. And so there's this question of what do we do with all of these sort of different issues? To what extent is the post-war settlement going to be similar to the Treaty of Versailles? To what extent are we going to try to uh, hold Nazi officials responsible? To what extent are we going to provide aid for Europe? All these sort of issues need to be kind of worked out. In the end, we do decide to hold both the Nazi and the Japanese governments responsible for their crimes. The Nuremberg trials were prosecuting Nazis and high-ranking government officials for war crimes. Hitler, of course, cannot be prosecuted because he committed suicide, but we do condemn to death a number of high-ranking Nazi officials. And at the Nuremberg trials, they established that the defense that I was just following orders is no longer an excuse for atrocities, because, of course, most or a lot of the Nazis who were responsible specifically for the Holocaust can say, well, I was ordered by my superiors to do this. I didn't have a choice. And the Nuremberg trials established that that's not a defense. We also put a lot of the Japanese leadership on trial, but there was limited. Some of the Japanese leadership was executed, but there was limited sort of support for this. And in order to rebuild post-war Japan, we specifically did not put the emperor on trial, which made this whole situation somewhat difficult. We also attempt to bring in the United States and the Soviet Union go on a sort of rush to try to get as many German scientists on their side as possible. Uh, especially scientists working on rocket technology. And so for the United States, we have this thing called Operation Paperclip, by which we more or less take a bunch of former Nazi scientists and bring them to the United States to try to get them integrated into our research and development. So on the one hand, yes, we're prosecuting Nazi scientists at the Nuremberg trials. On the other hand, we're bringing in former Nazis and integrating them into the U.S. scientific community. The real post-war showdown, of course, is between Joseph Stalin and Harry Truman. Stalin at this point is the totalitarian dictator of the Soviet Union, and Truman is, of course, the democratically elected president of the United States. The beginning phases of the Cold War are more or less sort of a political chess match between these two men. Stalin obviously has some significant advantages in that he's a totalitarian dictator. Here we see him guiding the ship of the Soviet state. And despite his portrayals of benevolence, he also has, the ruthless secret police and an absolute control over his economy. And so he's going to use all these tools at his disposal to put the Soviet Union in the best position possible in the post-war world. Whereas Truman is limited by what the United States is willing to publicly do, because, of course, we are still the city upon the hill, the shining example to everybody. The sort of metaphor that encapsulates this divide was coined by Winston Churchill. He described an iron curtain metaphorically descending across Europe. And so, an example of this is, Czechoslovakia elected a president that was not friendly to the Soviets, and then that president happened to fall out of a window and die. And then he was replaced by a much more friendly pro-Soviet president. So, did the Stalin's secret police execute the president of Czechoslovakia and replace him with a more pliant puppet? Eh, who's to say? So we're starting to see stuff like that happening. But as that happens, and as a pro-communist leader is elected in Czechoslovakia, all of a sudden Czechoslovakia becomes a communist socialist republic. They outlaw all other political parties, and they, tie themselves closely to Soviet Russia, and they basically vanish for us. And so we start to see this divide between the communist world of Eastern Europe, which you can see over here in the red, and the capitalist world of Western Europe, which you can see in the blue. And both sides are, of course, fighting to get these sort of border territories, for example, Yugoslavia, Austria, Albania, Greece, and Turkey. And so it is our goal to attempt to stop these countries from electing communist governments, because the moment they do, then you become like Czechoslovakia, you vanish behind the Iron Curtain, they start cutting off all contact with the West, and the Soviet sphere of influence expands. Our strategy to try to prevent this from happening was something called containment. The goal of containment was articulated by a guy named George Kennan in what's called the Long Telegram. It lays out this whole policy that we don't. The Red Army is right along this Iron Curtain. If we get too aggressive at pushing back against communism, there's really nothing to stop the Red Army from rolling through Europe, starting World War III. Stalin could conquer all of it without really exerting himself over. So instead of being overly aggressive, what we're going to do is sort of push back as strongly as possible against the expansion of Soviet power, containing it to the areas that it is. And so this is going to be our basic guiding philosophy throughout most of the Cold War, as opposed to something like aggressive rollback, where we're trying to take communist countries, overthrow their governments, and make them capitalist again. Stalin, of course, is aggressively trying to expand communism. And as pro communist governments start taking over, we're worried that, of course, these large countries are going to just vanish. And obviously, the big gain for Stalin is going to be China. And we're going to talk about the rise of the Communist Party in China probably tomorrow. But it's understandable. You need to understand that when we're looking at places like Austria, it's our goal to stop Austria from becoming communist, because if we don't, they're going to become like Bulgaria and simply become another Soviet socialist republic or another pro-communist country. Truman's attempt to or Truman's way to prosecute containment was something called the Truman Doctrine. And we're going to see a bunch of foreign policy doctrines here going forward throughout the Cold War. It basically means his strategy for prosecuting foreign policy. The Truman Doctrine, the goal was to again push containment through giving aid, economic aid specifically, to countries that are trying to resist communism, right? Because the goal of Stalin is to, in these areas that are economically destitute, communism and state planned economies seem like they're a good idea. And so you use the destitution in the aftermath of World War II to promote this communist agenda. The place that Truman first pushes this is Greece, because of course Greece was occupied by the Nazis for basically the entire war. The Greek people were destitute, and so Truman approves a massive aid package to Greece to try to rebuild the Greek economy to make communism look less appealing to the Greek people. We're trying to metaphorically hit Greece with the money train before Stalin hits them with the communism train. I mean, I guess either way, Greece is getting hit with the train, but the Greek economy has never really recovered, so it's somewhat of an apt metaphor. Expanding out the Truman Doctrine, we get what's called the Marshall Plan, named after one of our key generals in World War II. It lays out this massive aid plan for Europe. So rather than, as Truman did, simply giving aid to Greece and then also Turkey, which I didn't mention, but was another recipient of aid, the Marshall Plan is going to give aid to all of Europe in order to try to rebuild European countries, including the communist bloc, to hopefully build close relations with them and prevent them from tying themselves too closely to Moscow. The Marshall Plan provided aid, provided technology, provided American advisors, things like that. Stalin, on the other hand, was rebuilding his side mostly through forced labor. And so we hoped that the contrast between the aid that the United States was providing versus the sort of totalitarian communism that Stalin was providing would convince most countries that it was in their best interest to stay capitalist, to stay connected with the United States. So, as part of the Marshall Plan, we gave a ridiculous amount of aid to all of these countries in the order of billions of dollars. So, all of these countries got aid, uh, and we gave it to them in approximately these amounts. So, you can see Greece and Turkey got $500 million, something like that, which is a drop in the bucket compared to what France and the Netherlands and Belgium and West Germany and especially Great Britain got. This was beneficial to us for a variety of reasons. You can also see that we're giving aid to Italy at this point. Italy, of course, was not dismembered because they abandoned fascism after the war. Plus, we didn't view them as responsible for the conflict as Germany. And so the Marshall Plan had a number of different benefits for the United States. Obviously, building friends of Western Europe is incredibly important. But also, if we build these strong capitalist countries, they're going to buy products from us, and it's going to help jumpstart the American economy. Plus, having strong, prosperous allies in our coming global fight against communism is clearly beneficial. The first actual battle of the Cold War, quote unquote. And this is always complicated to talk about battles of the Cold War because, of course, the Cold War was not a technical war and there were wars embedded in it. But the Berlin Airlift is the first example of these sort of move, counter move, cloak and dagger games that we played throughout the Cold War. The Berlin Airlift was Stalin cut off all road and rail travel to Western Berlin. Berlin was, of course, in the middle of the Soviet-controlled zone, but of course, because it was the capital and the most important city in Germany, it was partitioned between all of the different allies. It was quickly realized by everyone involved that England and France were in no position to rebuild their parts of Germany, and so England, France, and the United States combined together their portions of Germany to form West Germany, and they combined together their portions of Berlin to form West Berlin. Stalin saw this as a betrayal and attempted to cut off all transit to West Berlin, assuming that the United States would not risk war and would instead have to simply just abandon their territories. Instead, the United States loaded up millions and millions of pounds and tons of supplies into planes and airlifted them into West Berlin, supplying the city for months purely by air and basically daring Joseph Stalin to shoot down these planes, which he considered doing. And there was some playing midair chicken with, Soviet jets attempting to block U.S. aircraft. But in the end, Stalin felt like shooting down these planes was too provocative. And so eventually, embarrassed, Stalin opened up the blockade again, and we were able to establish road and rail travel and the Berlin Airlift was successful. We use the Berlin Airlift as an example of this sort of game of chess, or this brinksmanship, or this, this sort of geopolitical game that we were playing, where you move these pieces to see what you can do without getting into war, but still giving your side the greatest advantage. And so the Cold War is defined by these series of things where we understand that we can't go to war with the USSR because right now the Red Army could just obliterate Europe, and the USSR can't go to war with us because we've got these atomic weapons that could utterly destroy the world. So what do we do? We're not quite sure. The demobilization period after World War II is a little bit complicated because at the same time, we don't need the level of military buildup that we had during the war. But at the same time, the Soviet Union is still there, and World War III could be looming on the horizon. So, what do you do about this? What we end up doing is demobilizing, but not totally demobilizing. We obviously release a ton of the troops from service, discharge a bunch of the troops from service, but we have to keep at a high level of military readiness at all time because if World War III comes, we need to be prepared. And so there's this question of like, what do we do with this whole deal? There was a short time period where we were the only power with nuclear weapons, and some people argued that we should start World War III now because as soon as Russia starts getting at the atomic bomb, we're going to be in a much weaker position. And then, of course, Russia does several years after, or just a couple years after our detonation of the atomic bomb in 49, detonates their own atomic bomb, which terrifies us. We create a military alliance with all of Western Europe that we call the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Russia creates their own version of this called the Warsaw Pact. These are mutual defense treaties saying that an attack on one is an attack on all. And they're designed in case of Soviet aggression. So if Stalin, tries to annex all of Germany, he understands that that's absolutely going to mean war with the United States, Great Britain, and France. So we also have to keep troops stationed in Europe in case, Stalin tries something. We attempt to sort of consolidate down our armed forces and maybe combine them into a single branch, but there's enough entrenched interests there that that doesn't happen. So we end up creating another branch of the military, the Air Force, of course, but we still have Air Force or aircraft as part of the Navy, and we basically just the military-industrial complex, as it was coined, as the phrase coined by Eisenhower describes it, simply continues to grow. We do come up with this plan called the nuclear blitzkrieg, which so we create this thing called, and I'm going to come back to this picture. We create this thing called Strategic Air Command, and the original goal of the Air Force was to basically be able to, in case of global war, deliver atomic weapons. And so we come up with this plan called the nuclear blitzkrieg, which says if war breaks out, the first thing we're going to do is overwhelming force nuke everything in the communist world. So we come up with this plan where we're going to drop nuclear weapons in all of these places with the tacit understanding given to the Russians that any type of war means you are absolutely going to be annihilated. Very quickly, the Soviet Union, or within about 10 years, the Soviet Union develops the capacity to do the same thing to the United States. And we enter into this sort of game of chicken under the philosophy of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The idea that in case of war, both sides are going to be obliterated, and this was seen as a deterrent to war, to nuclear war. And so the Cold War is a global death struggle between communism and capitalism, but it can't be fought with, it can't become a total war, because if it becomes a total war, everyone dies. And so we've got this weird thing where you're trying to fight a war without using all of your resources, and the end result is going to be really, really weird. In the United States, we also passed something called the National Security Act of 1947, which is coupled with the National Security Council Resolution 68, which basically argues that we need to be, again, constantly building up our military. And so the demobilization that we saw after World War I never really occurs. We keep a significant number of troops in active duty, and we're going to continue building weapons, building deterrence systems, building up our military capacity, with the idea that if World War III comes, we need to be prepared for it at any moment. And so the effect of this is, on the one hand, we don't see the economic downturn after the war that we had seen in previous wars. But on the other hand, we need to perpetually keep building our military forever, up until today, where we still feel the need to outspend the next, 10 countries combined in military funding. This leads, of course, to, as Dwight D. Eisenhower described, the military industrial complex, which means that it's a more or less political suicide for any president to ever suggest cutting military funding. And so that's a thing that we have to deal with now forever. The National Security Act also creates the Central Intelligence Agency. It's our foreign spy agency, and we'll talk more about them when we get into the actual sort of spy games of the Cold War. But with the FBI is, of course, our domestic spy agency, and now the CIA is our foreign spy agency.